My name is Harper Ashcroft. I'm 29, and I've spent the last 6 years building a multi-state agricultural logistics company. From a single leased truck and a spreadsheet of desperate cold calls into an operation that moves for some of the largest farming co-ops on the East Coast. I know how to read a supply chain the way other people read a room. Instantly, instinctively spotting the exact bottleneck that's about to cost someone their entire quarter before they've even noticed it forming. I know how to sit across from men twice my age who assumed, walking into the meeting, that they'd be negotiating with someone easier to push around, and watch that assumption dissolve once the numbers were actually on the table. I did not expect to need that particular instinct at my own brother's wedding. Standing in a reception hall, dripping with white orchids, watching my father raise a champagne glass and explain to 300 guests exactly how little he thought of the daughter standing 4 feet away from him. "To Landon," Graham Ashcroft said, his voice carrying the easy, practiced warmth of a man who had given this exact kind of toast 100 times in boardrooms, and never once worried about the room disagreeing with him. The son who's carried this family's legacy forward every single day since he could walk. Some of us. His eyes found mine across the room, brief, deliberate, the same look he'd been giving me at family gatherings for years. Took a little longer to figure out where we actually belonged. "But we're proud of you regardless, Landon. Real proud." The room didn't go silent, exactly. 300 guests kept their champagne flutes raised, kept their smiles fixed in the specific, practiced way of people who either hadn't caught the insult buried inside the toast, or had decided collectively that noticing it wasn't worth the discomfort. I stood there in a bridesmaid's dress. I'd paid for myself, doing the same cold, precise arithmetic I run through a dozen times a week, evaluating a shipping contract. Except this time the numbers belonged to my own life. 6 years of building something real, something that employed 43 people and moved $11 million of freight a year, reduced in front of everyone who mattered to this family. Took a little longer to figure out where she belonged. Asterisk. If you've ever had your actual life's work erased in a single toast, in front of everyone who was supposed to be celebrating with you, I need you to stay with me, because this story does not end where my father expected it to. I want to explain what took a little longer to figure out where she belonged actually meant. Underneath the practiced warmth of my father's toast, because I don't think it lands with its real weight without the 6 years of context sitting beneath it. I left Ashcroft Industrial Group's corporate track at 23, against my father's explicit wishes, to start a logistics company, he called, at the time, a nice hobby before you come back and take a real position here. I'd grown up watching my brother Landon groomed for the family business from the time he could hold a pen, given a title before he'd finished business school, handed accounts and responsibilities that I, 2 years older than him, was never once offered. Not because I hadn't asked, but because my father had decided, early and permanently, that the company's future ran through his son and not his daughter's. My younger sister Sienna had found her own accommodation with that reality, building a comfortable career in corporate branding that kept her safely inside the family's orbit without ever threatening its hierarchy. I was the one who'd left entirely, and in my family, leaving had never once been forgiven as a legitimate choice. It had only ever been reframed as a failure to understand where I belonged. "You'll come back once the hobby runs its course," my father told me, the year I turned 24, watching me struggle through my first brutal winter of thin margins and unreliable contracts, with an expression that looked, in hindsight, almost hopeful that I would. Everyone needs to learn that lesson eventually. I hadn't come back. I'd built something instead, quietly, methodically, the same disciplined way. I built every route optimization and every vendor relationship, and I understood, standing in that reception hall 6 years later listening to my father's toast, that none of it had ever actually registered with him as success. It had only ever registered as evidence that I'd temporarily wandered off the path he'd just already decided was the only legitimate one. If you've ever built something real, only to have your own family treat it as a phase you'd eventually grow out of. Comment, I know that dismissal below. This story is for you. My mother found me by the bar 20 minutes after the toast, her voice carrying the particular bright managed warmth she reserved for conversations she'd clearly rehearsed in advance. "Your father didn't mean anything by that, sweetheart. You know how he gets when he's had a little champagne. He's very proud of you too in his own way. He's never once called my company anything other than a hobby, Mom," I said, keeping my voice level. The same steady register I use closing a difficult negotiation. "Not at Christmas, not at Thanksgiving, not tonight, in front of 300 people. He just doesn't understand it the way he understands the family business," she said, which I noted, even in the moment, was not actually a defense of my father, so much as a quiet confirmation that she agreed with the underlying assessment. "Maybe if you explained it to him better?" Landon always makes sure to walk him through the quarterly numbers personally. Perhaps that's part of it. I let that go, mostly because I understood. Standing there with a glass of champagne I hadn't touched, that my mother's version of support had never once, in 29 years, included actually challenging my father's assessment of anything. Vanessa Ashcroft ran an entire charitable foundation with a board of trustees who deferred to her judgment daily, and yet somehow, inside her own marriage, she had never located the same authority to tell her husband he was wrong about their own daughter. My sister Sienna, catching the tail end of the conversation, offered her own version of comfort. A few minutes later, equally unhelpful in its own way. "Dad's just old-fashioned about this stuff," she said. "You know how he is. I wouldn't take it personally." "It's hard not to take it personally when it's about me, specifically in front of everyone," I said, and Sienna, to her credit, had the decency to look briefly uncomfortable before the moment passed. And she drifted back toward the dance floor, back into the comfortable, safe distance she'd maintained from every real conflict in this family for her entire adult life. If you've ever had family members offer comfort that was really just a request for you to stop making them uncomfortable, comment. That's not actually support below. We're only in chapter 1. Landon found me an hour later, flushed with champagne, and the specific, expansive confidence of a man having the best night of his life. And what he said next told me, more clearly than my father's toast had, exactly how thoroughly this family had constructed its own story about which sibling actually mattered. "Don't let Dad's toast get to you," he said, clapping a hand on my shoulder with an easy, patronizing warmth. "You know how he is. Besides," he lowered his voice slightly, conspiratorial as though sharing something generous. "Once I'm running the company fully, I'll make sure there's a place for you somewhere. Logistics, maybe, since that's clearly your thing. Nothing fancy, but family takes care of family, right?" I stood there for a long moment, doing the specific cold arithmetic I do for a living. Except this time the numbers were staggeringly, almost comically wrong, in a way my brother had absolutely no idea about. My company didn't need a place inside Ashcroft Industrial Group. My company, over the past 18 months, had quietly become the primary logistics contractor for 3 of the agricultural co-ops that supplied raw materials to Ashcroft, Industrial Group's largest manufacturing subsidiary. A fact buried deep enough in a subsidiary's vendor contracts that I doubted anyone at the parent company, least of all my brother, had any idea whose name was actually on those agreements. "That's generous of you," I said, and I meant it to sound exactly as flat as it came out, though Landon, riding the specific high of a man who has just gotten married and been publicly celebrated as the family's future, didn't seem to notice the flatness at all. I didn't say anything else that night about what I actually knew. I want to be honest about why. The same honesty I'd want from anyone telling me this story. It wasn't strategy yet, not fully. It was simply that some part of me needed to sit with what had just happened. The toast, my mother's non-defense, Sienna's discomfort, Landon's patronizing offer of a place, inside a company that was, in ways none of them yet understood, already more dependent on me than I would ever again be dependent on it, before I decided exactly what I wanted to do about any of it. If you've ever realized in a single conversation that you already held more leverage than the people condescending to you could possibly imagine, comment. They have no idea below. Chapter 2 is where I decide what to do with that leverage. I left the reception before the cake cutting, claiming an early flight for a client meeting that wasn't strictly a lie, though I'd built in enough flexibility that I could have stayed if I'd wanted to. I drove back to my hotel in silence. No radio. The same humming quiet of a mind running calculations it had been avoiding for longer than I wanted to admit. I thought about the $11 million of freight my company moved every year, about the 43 people whose paychecks depended on decisions I made, about the specific pride I'd built quietly, methodically, entirely outside the shadow of a family that had never once thought to ask what my actual balance sheet looked like before deciding what kind of daughter I was. I thought, too, about my grandfather, Ashcroft Industrial Group's original founder, dead 11 years now, and the single conversation I still remembered clearly from my last visit with him, before he passed. I'd been 20 years old, still fully inside the family's expected track, and he'd taken me aside at a holiday gathering, with the specific careful attention I remembered from him, more than from either of my parents. "Your father thinks legacy means keeping everything inside the walls he built," he told me. "I think legacy means whoever's smart enough and hungry enough to actually build something lasting. Don't let anyone convince you those are the same thing, Harper. They're not." I hadn't fully understood what he meant at the time. Sitting in my hotel room that night, still in my bridesmaid's dress, I understood it with a clarity that felt almost physical. If you've ever had one relative once tell you something true that took years to actually land. Comment. I needed that memory tonight, below. My assistant, Deshawn, called me the next morning with a routine update on a vendor contract renewal, the same kind of call I took a dozen times a month. Except this particular contract happened to be with Meridian Processing, one of the 3 agricultural co-ops whose raw material supply chain fed directly into Ashcroft Industrial Group's largest manufacturing subsidiary. I'd known distantly that our logistics work touched Ashcroft's supply chain somewhere down the line. The agricultural sector was smaller and more interconnected than outsiders assumed, and I'd built my company specifically in corridors. I understood well, without ever bothering to trace exactly how deep those connections actually ran into my own family's business. "I want the full vendor chain mapped out today," I told Deshawn. "Every contract Meridian and our other 2 co-op clients have downstream, all the way to final buyers. I have a specific reason for asking, and I'll explain once I see the numbers." The map that came back that afternoon confirmed something I'd suspected but never fully quantified. Our logistics company handled, directly or through subcontracted routes, nearly 60% of the raw agricultural material that fed Ashcroft Industrial Group's flagship manufacturing plant. The same plant my father referenced constantly as the beating heart of the company. He was so proud Landon would inherit if my company slowed its delivery schedules, renegotiated its rates, or simply declined to renew a single key contract. Ashcroft Industrial Group's primary revenue driver would face supply disruptions, serious enough to affect quarterly earnings within a single reporting cycle. I sat with that information for a long time, the same cold, careful stillness I bring to any negotiation once I understand exactly how much leverage I actually hold. I want to be clear about something, the same honesty I'd want from anyone telling me this account. My first instinct wasn't malicious. I hadn't built these relationships, intending to someday use them as a weapon against my own family. I'd built them because they made good business sense. Because Meridian and the other co-ops were reliable, profitable partners who happened to sit upstream of a company I deliberately kept my professional distance from for 6 years. The leverage had simply arrived as a byproduct of building something real, entirely on my own terms, without my father's help or his blessing. What I did with that leverage, once I understood I had it, was entirely a different question. One I wasn't ready to answer yet, sitting in my office with Deshawn's vendor map spread across my desk, but one I understood. For the first time since that toast, I finally had the actual power to answer on my own terms, instead of anyone else's. If you've ever discovered that the thing you built quietly, for yourself, without any family's blessing, turned out to hold more power than the family who dismissed it ever imagined. Comment, built without them, more powerful than them below. Landon called me 3 days after the wedding, his voice carrying a different register than the champagne-warm condescension from the reception. Something closer to genuine, if clumsy, gratitude. "Hey, I wanted to actually thank you for coming," he said. "I know things with Dad can be a lot. I didn't mean anything weird by what I said about finding you a place. I just wanted you to know the door's open. Whenever you're ready for it." "I appreciate that," I said, careful to keep my voice neutral, giving nothing away yet about exactly how thoroughly our positions had already reversed without him realizing it. "How's everything settling in? Post-wedding? Business side of things going smoothly?" "Actually, a little bumpy," he admitted, with the easy, unguarded honesty of a man who still had no idea. He was talking to someone who already understood his company's vulnerabilities better than he did. "Some of our supply contracts are getting renegotiated this quarter. Dad's stressed about margins on the manufacturing side. Nothing we can't handle, though. We've got good people on it." I didn't tell him, in that moment, that good people on it almost certainly meant people who had no idea. The company's actual leverage over its own supply chain had already shifted entirely into my hands. I said something appropriately vague and sympathetic instead, and I hung up understanding, with a clarity that had been building steadily since the reception, exactly how much longer I intended to let this family continue believing the story it had always told about which sibling actually held the power in this equation. I didn't act on the leverage immediately. I want to be honest about that. The same honesty I've tried to bring to every part of this account. For the first few weeks after the wedding, I told myself I was simply running my business the way I always had. That the vendor map Deshawn had built for me was just useful context, rather than the opening move in something larger. It took me longer than I'd like to admit to stop pretending that distinction actually meant anything. I spent those weeks doing what I do best, sitting with numbers until they told me the whole story, instead of just the part that was convenient. I pulled every contract Meridian Processing and our other 2 agricultural co-op clients had with Ashcroft Industrial Group's manufacturing subsidiary, cross-referencing delivery schedules, rate structures, penalty clauses for late shipment, force majeure language, everything. I built the same kind of methodical patient case I'd build for any major logistics negotiation, except this particular case wasn't really about logistics at all. If you've ever started building something out of quiet curiosity and realized, weeks in, that it had turned into a case, comment, "That's how it always starts," below. This is where the real digging begins. I found the first genuinely useful piece of information almost by accident, buried in a routine compliance filing Meridian's general counsel had shared with me as part of an unrelated audit trail request. Ashcroft Industrial Group's flagship manufacturing plant, the one my father called the beating heart of the company, at every family gathering, had quietly renegotiated its raw material contracts 18 months earlier, under considerably worse terms than the company's public shareholder reports suggested, a fact that made sense. Once I traced the timeline against a series of production delays that had never been fully explained in any public filing I could find. I called Declan Pierce, a corporate attorney I'd worked with years earlier on an unrelated contract dispute, someone whose discretion I trusted enough to bring this to before I decided what, if anything, I actually wanted to do with it. We met at his office, my vendor map and Meridian's filings spread across his conference table, and I watched his expression shift, page by page, from polite professional curiosity into something considerably more focused. "This is more than an interesting coincidence," he said finally, tapping the production delay timeline. "If Ashcroft Industrial Group renegotiated these contracts under distress, and that distress was never disclosed to shareholders, the way it should have been, you're looking at a company with a materially weaker supplies position than its public reporting suggests, combined with the leverage your own company already holds over 60% of that supply chain." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I want to be direct with you about what this actually means, Harper. You're not just holding a grudge from a wedding toast anymore. You're holding real, quantifiable power over a company's ability to keep its primary revenue driver running. That's not something you use lightly, and it's not something you can unuse once you start. If you've ever discovered that the company dismissing your success was quietly more fragile than it let anyone believe, comment. The numbers don't lie, below. We're just getting started." brought in Celeste Monroe. The following week, a chairwoman at Horizon Capital Investments he'd worked with on prior matters. Someone with the specific expertise to evaluate exactly what an undisclosed contract renegotiation might mean for Ashcroft Industrial Group's standing with its actual shareholders and board. I hadn't expected, walking into that meeting, quite how methodical and unemotional Celeste's assessment would be. A welcome contrast, I realized, to how personally I'd been carrying every piece of this since the wedding. Companies renegotiate supplier contracts under distress more often than the public ever hears about, Celeste said, reviewing the timeline Declan had assembled. The question that actually matters here isn't whether it happened. It's whether it was material enough that it should have been disclosed, and whether the board was fully informed when they signed off on the public numbers that quarter. If the answer to either of those is no, that's not just an embarrassing family secret, Harper. That's a fiduciary problem, and potentially a securities disclosure problem, for a company with real institutional investors who deserve accurate information. Can you tell, from what we have, whether the board actually knew? I asked. Not yet, she said, but I know how to find out. I have contacts on Ashcroft's board who'd talk to me about general industry conditions without necessarily realizing what they were confirming. It's a slower path than simply confronting your father directly, but it's the kind of groundwork that means you'll know exactly how this actually happened before anyone in your family gets a chance to spin a version of it for you first. I appreciated, more than I expected to, the specific reassurance of watching two experienced professionals treat this with the same rigor I'd want applied to any negotiation of this size. Not indulging the emotional weight of a wedding toast, but taking the underlying facts seriously enough to build something that would hold up regardless of how personally invested I was in the outcome. If you've ever had professionals treat the thing that hurt you personally with the same rigor they'd apply to any serious case, comment that mattered more than I expected. Below, I want to explain, before I go further, exactly what 15 years of watching my father run Ashcroft Industrial Group had actually taught me about how this family operated, because I don't think the leverage itself carries its full weight without that context. My father built his identity entirely around the appearance of unshakable control. A company that never showed weakness, a family that presented, at every gathering and every public event, a united, prosperous front that suggested nothing could touch the Ashcroft name. I understood watching that production delay timeline align with a quietly renegotiated contract, that this appearance had always mattered more to him than the substance underneath it. He hadn't disclosed the distressed renegotiation because admitting weakness, even to shareholders who deserved to know, would have cracked the specific image he'd spent 30 years building. I thought about every family dinner where he'd dismissed my company as a hobby, every holiday toast where Landon's title got celebrated, while my actual revenue numbers went unmentioned. And I understood, sitting in Declan's office, with the full shape of Ashcroft Industrial Group's vulnerability finally in front of me, exactly how much of my father's confidence had always depended on nobody looking closely enough to check whether it was actually earned or simply performed. I need everything traced properly, I told Declan, not because I want to destroy anything, because I want the truth documented, clearly enough that no one in this family can keep pretending the story they've always told about which of us actually built something real. I visited Meridian's production facility myself the following week, partly for legitimate business reasons, a routine site visit I did periodically with all our major clients, and partly because I wanted to see, firsthand, exactly how tightly our delivery schedules actually intersected with Ashcroft's manufacturing timeline. Standing in that facility, watching pallets of raw material move through loading docks on schedules my own company had designed, I felt something shift in my chest that I can only describe as the specific, clarifying weight of understanding exactly how much control I actually held, made suddenly physical and real instead of abstract. The plant manager, a woman named Priya, who'd worked with my company for 4 years, mentioned offhand, while walking me through the loading schedule, that Ashcroft's manufacturing plant had specifically requested an accelerated delivery window for the upcoming quarter. Something about needing to hit some year-end numbers cleanly, I think, for a board presentation. I filed that detail away carefully, understanding, even as she said it, exactly how useful that specific piece of context might eventually become. Sienna, my sister, called me 2 days after the site visit, her voice carrying a rare uncertainty. I hadn't heard from her since we were teenagers. "I overheard Dad on the phone with someone from the plant," she said. "He sounded worried, Harper. Actually worried, not the usual performance. Worried he does for the board. Do you know anything about what's going on over there?" "I know a little," I said carefully, unwilling yet to say more than that, even to my sister, whose discomfort at the wedding I'd noted, but who had so far done nothing to actually earn a deeper confidence from me. "Why are you asking me specifically?" "Because your company handles a lot of their supply chain, doesn't it?" she said, and something in her voice told me she'd finally started doing arithmetic of her own, even if she hadn't yet reached the full conclusion. I didn't realize until recently how much of what Dad's company actually depends on runs through people like you. I don't think he realizes it either, honestly. I don't think he's ever really looked at your business closely enough to understand what it's actually become. I didn't confirm anything further, but I noted, with some private satisfaction, that my sister, quiet, conflict-averse Sienna, who had spent her entire adult life staying safely inside the family's comfortable hierarchy, was, for the first time in years, starting to ask exactly the right questions. If you've ever watched someone who usually avoided conflict start quietly connecting the dots on their own, comment, "Even she's starting to see it." Below, my mother called midway through this stretch, her voice carrying an unusual note of concern that told me, before she said anything specific, that something in the family's usual rhythm had shifted. "Your father's been under a lot of pressure at work lately," she said. "I don't know all the details, but I think there's something with the manufacturing plant that's got him more stressed than I've seen him in years. I just wanted you to know, in case Landon mentions anything. I know things have been tense since the wedding, but I hope you'd still want to know if your father needed support." I sat with that for a long moment, the same careful, clinical stillness I bring to any negotiation once I understand the other side is more vulnerable than they're letting on. "I hope things work out for him," I said, which was true in the narrow, technical sense and not at all true in the sense my mother probably wanted it to be. "You could call him, you know," she added. "Sometimes a gesture like that means more than people expect." I didn't call him. I want to be honest about why. I understood by then that whatever gesture my mother was hoping for from me had never once been offered in the other direction. Not after 6 years of my company being dismissed as a hobby. Not after a wedding toast that erased my success in front of 300 witnesses. Not after Landon's patronizing offer of a place inside a company that, unbeknownst to him, already depended on mine for its survival. I wasn't interested in performing generosity toward a family that had never once extended the same generosity toward me. I called Declan instead and told him I was ready to move forward with formalizing everything. Not yet a confrontation, but the careful, methodical groundwork that would make sure that whenever this finally did come to a head, I would be the one holding every piece of documented truth the moment it mattered. If you've ever had a family reach out for support only once they needed something from you, after years of offering none in return, comment, "I see that pattern below." Chapter 3 is where everything finally comes to a head. Celeste's contacts on Ashcroft's board came back with an answer within 3 weeks, and it was worse, in its own quiet way, than anything I'd expected. The board had not been fully informed of the distressed contract renegotiation. Graham had presented it internally as a routine cost adjustment, burying the actual severity of the supply disruption in language. Vague enough that 2 directors Celeste spoke with admitted, off the record, that they'd never fully understood how close the manufacturing plant had come to a production halt 18 months earlier. "This isn't just an embarrassing secret anymore," Celeste told me, laying out her findings across Declan's conference table. "Your father made a material omission to his own board on a matter that directly affected shareholder value. Depending on how the SEC would eventually view it, That's a serious governance failure, potentially serious enough to trigger a formal inquiry if it ever surfaced through the right channels. I sat with that for a long moment, doing the same cold, precise arithmetic. I run through evaluating any major negotiation, except the numbers this time added up to something considerably larger than a wedding toast. I couldn't stop replaying. My father hadn't just dismissed my company as a hobby for 6 years. He had built an entire identity around a control and competence. He hadn't actually been exercising honestly, even with the people legally entitled to know the truth. If you've ever discovered that the parent who dismissed your success had been quietly failing at the exact competence he built his whole identity around. Comment: the mask was never real below. We're at the edge of the reveal now. I spent the week after Celeste's findings doing something I hadn't expected to need to do. Sitting with the specific discomfort of holding information that could genuinely hurt people I'd grown up with, regardless of how they'd treated me. I want to be honest about that discomfort, the same honesty I've tried to bring to every part of this account. Building leverage in the abstract, tracing contracts and disclosure failures on paper had felt clean and clinical, the same detached competence I bring to any complex negotiation. Sitting with the knowledge that using it fully might cost my father his position, might unravel Landon's entire understanding of the company he'd just been publicly celebrated as inheriting, felt considerably heavier once it stopped being hypothetical. I called my former business mentor, a woman named Rosalind, who'd helped me structure my very first fleet financing deal 6 years earlier, someone entirely outside my family, who'd known nothing about the wedding or the toast, or any of the personal history weighing on this decision. I laid out the situation in the abstract, careful not to name names, and asked her, plainly, whether she thought I was about to do something I'd regret. "You're not creating the consequences, Harper," she told me. "You're just the first person who bothered to look closely enough to notice they already existed. If your father built something fragile and hid that fragility from the people entitled to know, that was always going to come apart eventually. The only question is whether you're the one who finally makes it visible, or whether you spend the rest of your life protecting a story that was never true to begin with, the same way everyone in that family has already been doing for years." I sat with her answer for a long time after we hung up, understanding that she'd given me something I hadn't fully allowed myself yet. Permission to stop treating my own clarity as something to apologize for. If you've ever needed someone outside a difficult situation to confirm that you weren't the one creating the damage, just the one finally willing to see it. Comment: that permission mattered below. Landon called me again the following week, and this conversation carried none of the easy, patronizing warmth from our last one. "Something's going on at the company," he said, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard from him before. "Dad's been in closed-door meetings for days. I heard someone mention Horizon Capital. Do you know anything about that?" I thought about how to answer that, weighing for a long moment exactly how much I wanted to reveal before I'd fully decided on my own next move. "I might know a few things," I said carefully. "Why does it matter to you specifically?" "Because if the company's in real trouble, I need to know what I'm actually walking into," he said. And something in his voice, genuine fear, not performance, landed differently than anything he'd said at the wedding. "Harper, if you know something, I need you to tell me. I'm not trying to play games here." "You offered me a place in this company at your wedding, Landon," I said, as though I needed one, as though 6 years of building something real on my own somehow added up to less than a title you were handed before you'd finished business school. "I think. Before I tell you anything, you should sit with that for a while, the same way I've been sitting with it since the reception." "That's fair," he said, quieter now, some of the tightness draining out of his voice into something closer to genuine reckoning. I didn't think about it that way at the time. I don't think I've ever really had to think about anything that way, honestly. That's kind of the problem, isn't it? It was the first thing my brother had said to me in the entire course of this ordeal. That sounded like actual self-awareness rather than performance. And I let myself sit with the smallest possibility that whatever came out of this eventually, Landon at least might be capable of examining his own assumptions more honestly than either of our parents had ever shown themselves willing to. "I'll tell you what I know once. I've decided exactly how I'm handling this," I said. "But I'm not doing it to protect you from consequences you've never had to face before. I'm doing it because you asked honestly, for the first time since I've known you as an adult. If you've ever watched someone begin, for the very first time, to actually examine their own unearned assumptions, comment, growth, even late, still counts below." My father called 2 days later, and it was, in 11 years since my grandfather's death, the first time he had ever called me first about anything related to business. "I understand you've been in contact with some people connected to my board," he said, his voice carrying a controlled tightness. I recognized immediately the same tone he used in negotiations when he was trying very hard not to show how much ground he'd already lost. "I'd like to understand what exactly you think you're doing, Harper. I think I'm finally looking closely at something this family has spent years telling me wasn't worth my attention," I said, keeping my voice level. "You've called my company a hobby for 6 years, Dad. Meanwhile, it turns out that hobby moves 60% of the raw material that keeps your flagship plant running. And you never once disclosed to your own board how close that plant came to a shutdown 18 months ago. I'd say that's worth my attention now, wouldn't you?" The silence on the line stretched long enough that I checked whether the call had dropped. "You have no idea what you're about to do to this family," he said finally, low and controlled in a way that told me, more clearly than anything else in this entire ordeal, exactly how much he understood about what he'd actually done, and exactly how little he'd ever expected to answer for it. "I think I have a very clear idea," I said. "I've spent 6 years building something you never once respected. I'm not interested in destroying what you built. I am interested in you finally understanding exactly how much of it was never actually as solid as you let everyone believe." He tried a different approach before the call ended, something closer to bargaining than the controlled authority he'd opened with. "Whatever this costs the company, it costs your brother too, you understand? Everything he's worked for. Is that really what you want? To punish him for something he didn't even do?" "Landon's the first person in this family who actually asked me an honest question this week," I said. "I'd worry more about what your own choices are about to cost him before you try to make that my responsibility. If you've ever had a parent respond to being caught not with an apology, but with a warning about what your accountability is going to cost everyone else. Comment, that's not remorse below, almost to the reveal. I stopped waiting for any version of this family to simply do the right thing on their own. Somewhere around the time I understood, with total clarity, exactly what 6 years of being dismissed as, not quite figured out where she belongs, had actually cost me, not in money, which I had plenty of, but in the specific quiet toll of building something extraordinary and having it treated, at every family gathering, as though it barely existed. I thought about the wedding toast, my mother's non-defense, Sienna's late but genuine questions, Landon's patronizing offer of a place inside a company that had never once outpaced mine in anything that actually mattered. I thought about my grandfather's words, the ones that had taken years to fully land. Legacy means whoever's smart enough and hungry enough to actually build something lasting. I called Declan and Celeste both that same afternoon and told them I was ready to move everything forward. Not as an attack, but as an accounting, delivered plainly, with documentation no one in this family could argue their way around any longer. "There's one more piece you should know before we do," Declan said. "Celeste's contact on the board mentioned something else, almost in passing, that your father's original founding stake in the company came with conditions tied to continued, transparent governance, conditions written into the company's original bylaws by your grandfather specifically. If a material governance failure like this one were ever formally established, those bylaws may allow the board to force a leadership transition entirely independent of who your father originally intended to hand the company to." I sat with that for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, exactly how much larger this had just become than a wedding toast. I couldn't stop replaying, and exactly how much closer. My grandfather's original vision for this company's legacy was about to come back into play, in a way none of them had seen coming. If you've ever found out that a long-dead relative had quietly protected exactly the outcome you were now fighting for, without ever knowing you'd need it, comment, he saw this coming below. Chapter 4 is where everything finally comes together. Celeste requested a formal board meeting. 3 weeks later, framed neutrally as a routine governance review, though I understood, sitting in the small conference room, adjoining Ashcroft Industrial Group's boardroom. While the meeting proceeded without me, exactly how far from routine the next hour was actually going to be. Declan had prepared the full documentation package, the undisclosed contract renegotiation, the production delay timeline, the vendor concentration analysis, showing my own company's 60% control over the plant's raw material supply, and the original bylaws language, establishing the board's authority to act on exactly this kind of governance failure. I wasn't in the room when Celeste presented it. I want to be honest about that, the same honesty I've tried to bring to every part of this account. I'd decided deliberately that this needed to be the board's own reckoning with facts, not a daughter's public confrontation of her father, in front of people who'd spent decades deferring to his authority. Declan called me 40 minutes into the meeting, his voice carrying the specific, careful calm of someone delivering news he understood was enormous. "It's done," he said. "The board's invoking the governance clause. Your father's being placed on administrative leave from operational control, effective immediately, pending a full independent audit of the disclosure failures. They want a leadership transition plan on the table within 30 days. If you've ever waited outside a room while a truth you'd spent months documenting finally changed everything inside it, comment, the wait was the hardest part below. This is the reveal." Declan gave me the fuller account later that evening once he'd had time to debrief properly with Celeste after the meeting adjourned. Apparently, my father had tried, initially, to characterize the entire situation as a family dispute, being weaponized by a resentful daughter, an argument that had held for perhaps the first 10 minutes, until one of the longer-tenured board members, a man named Whitfield, who had served alongside my grandfather decades earlier, had asked, plainly, whether the contract renegotiation and its associated production risk had, in fact, been disclosed to the board at the time it happened. "Your father didn't have a good answer for that question," Declan told me. "Whitfield apparently remembered your grandfather's original governance language specifically, because he'd been on the board when it was written," he said, and I'm told this shifted the entire room, that Nathaniel Ashcroft built those provisions precisely so that no single person's comfort could ever again be allowed to outweigh the board's right to the truth. He said, "Honoring that clause today was, in his words, the last thing I can do to actually honor what your grandfather intended this company to become." I sat with that for a long time after Declan told me, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that my grandfather's protection of this outcome had been more direct and more personal than even the bylaws language alone had suggested. A man who had specifically built in a mechanism to prevent exactly the kind of quiet, image-preserving dishonesty my father had eventually chosen, and a colleague who had remembered that intention clearly enough to honor it, decades later, at precisely the moment it mattered most. If you've ever learned that someone who knew and respected a relative you lost had quietly carried forward exactly what that relative would have wanted, comment, legacy really does outlast us below. My father called me that evening, his voice stripped of the controlled authority I'd heard in every previous conversation, something rawer and more exposed underneath it that I hadn't heard from him in my entire life. "I don't understand how you could do this," he said, "to your own family. Over a toast." "This was never about a toast," I said, keeping my voice level, though something in me ached, unexpectedly, at hearing him sound genuinely lost for the first time I could remember. "It was about 6 years of you deciding. My life's work wasn't worth acknowledging, while quietly running a company you weren't actually being honest about, even with the people legally entitled to the truth. I didn't create the governance failure, Dad. I just finally looked closely enough to notice it was there. Everything I built," he started, "was built on the same appearance of control you've been performing our whole family's entire life," I said gently, but without backing down. I'm not the one who dismantled it. I'm just the first person who stopped pretending the performance was real. Your grandfather would be ashamed of what's happening to this company, he said. A last, desperate reach for a kind of authority he no longer actually held. I think Grandpa Nathaniel built the exact mechanism that just removed you specifically, because he anticipated a moment like this one, I said quietly. I think he'd be a lot more ashamed of 18 months of hidden distress than he would be of a board finally doing what he built them to do. He didn't have an answer for that. The call ended in a silence, heavier than any of our previous conversations, and I sat with it for a long time afterward, understanding that whatever grief I felt watching my father's identity come apart didn't actually change whether the truth had needed to surface. It simply meant that even necessary truths cost something, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise, just because the cost had finally actually landed. If you've ever done the right thing and still felt the weight of what it cost someone you loved, even when they'd earned the consequences, comment, both things can be true, below. The independent audit took 4 months to complete, longer and more exhausting than I think any of us fully expected at the outset, confirming everything Celeste's initial findings had suggested, and adding several additional disclosure failures the board hadn't previously known about. My father resigned his position rather than face formal removal, a distinction that mattered more to his pride than to the actual outcome. And the board, following the original bylaws, language my grandfather had written decades earlier, moved toward a leadership transition that surprised nearly everyone in the family except me. Landon, to his considerable credit, didn't fight the board's eventual decision to bring in outside leadership rather than simply installing him in our father's place. I don't think I'm ready for that job, he told me, over coffee, the first genuinely honest conversation we'd had as adults. I don't think I ever actually earned the track I was put on. I just walked it because it was there. I think I need to actually build something myself before anyone hands me control of something this size again. That's more self-awareness than I expected from you a few months ago, I said, and he laughed, a little ruefully, acknowledging the truth of it without flinching from it. A few months ago, I offered my own sister a place in a company that turned out to depend on hers for survival, he said. I've had some time to sit with how much of my life I never actually had to think critically about. I'd rather spend a few years actually earning something than keep pretending I already had, he told me. That same afternoon, that he'd applied for an operational role at a mid-sized manufacturing firm, 2 states away, deliberately outside the Ashcroft name, wanting, in his own words, to find out what I can actually do without a family safety net catching me the moment I stumble. I didn't know, sitting across from him, whether that resolve would hold. Once the initial humility of this experience faded, I found myself hoping, more than I expected to, that it would. If you've ever watched someone finally take real accountability for privilege they never had to examine before, comment, that's real growth below. Sienna reached out to me during that same stretch, no longer the conflict-averse sister who drifted back to the dance floor, rather than sit with my discomfort at the wedding. I've been thinking about starting something of my own too, she told me. Not because Dad's company is falling apart, but because watching you build something real, entirely outside this family's approval, made me realize how much I'd been settling for safety, instead of actually building anything I could call mine. She left her position in corporate branding within the year, launching a boutique consultancy that, the last I heard, was doing well enough to make our father's old dismissiveness feel, in hindsight, almost laughably short-sighted. My mother's reaction was more complicated, and I want to be honest that it never fully resolved into the kind of clean, satisfying accountability this story might seem to promise. She apologized, eventually, in a conversation that was more genuine than any of her previous non-defenses, acknowledging, plainly, that she had spent decades prioritizing her marriage's comfort over her children's honest treatment. I told myself keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping the family together, she said. I understand now that I was really just keeping myself comfortable and calling it peace, so I didn't have to examine what it actually cost you. It was a real apology, and I appreciated it, and it also didn't erase 29 years of watching her, choose silence every single time. Silence was easier than confronting my father. I've come to understand that some relationships repair slowly, imperfectly, over years, rather than in a single clarifying conversation. And I've made peace with the fact that my relationship with my mother is likely to be exactly that kind of slow, imperfect, ongoing project. If you've ever accepted an apology as real and still understood that it couldn't undo years of silence, comment both can be true below. I didn't take any position within Ashcroft Industrial Group once the leadership transition was complete, despite an offer from the new board chair to join in an advisory capacity, given my company's critical relationship to their supply chain. I want to be clear about why, the same clarity I've tried to bring to every decision in this account. I had already built something entirely my own, entirely outside this family's validation, and I understood, finally, with total certainty, that returning to work inside a company I'd spent 6 years being told I didn't belong in would have meant accepting, on some level, that my grandfather's original vision of legacy, built by whoever was hungry and capable enough to actually build it, rather than whoever happened to be handed a title, didn't apply to me in the same way it applied to my brother. My company has grown considerably since that wedding, now moving freight across 9 states instead of 4, employing 61 people instead of 43. I still think sometimes about my father's toast, the specific, casual cruelty of took a little longer to figure out where she belonged. And I understand now, with a clarity I didn't have standing in that reception hall, that I had never actually needed him to figure out where I belonged. I had already built that place myself, entirely on my own terms, long before he ever bothered to notice it existed. The greatest victory was never going to be watching my father lose his position. It was understanding, finally, that I had never actually needed the Ashcroft name to know exactly what I was worth. The end.